Welcome to the Health Catalyst podcast, brought to you by YPO. Here we talk about the business of health innovation, and I sit down with industry leaders who have been in the trenches. My goal is to share the lessons and provide practical and actionable advice to help you launch, grow, and scale your business. I am your host, Rodrigo Hute. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, my guest is Kurt Landon, and we'll be discussing how to build a strong company culture. Kurt has 3 decades of experience in human resources. He was the former chief people officer at Pinterest and has held senior HR roles at Biogen, Johnson & Johnson, and others. He's also the founder of Inspira and currently serves as a chief customer officer at Leader. Kurt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for having me. It's great to be here.
I am very excited. I am very excited about this conversation. I think that building company culture, it's one of the most important things that any leader can do. And I want to get started by just sharing the quote, a famous quote from Peter Drucker. I'm sure that all of you have heard of it or seen it at some point in your life. But the quote says, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And although I don't fully agree with the quote completely, I do believe that culture is one of those things that can make or break a company. So today, Kurt is going to help us think through the things, and I'm sure that we're going to be able to do a better job as CEOs and leaders of companies. So if you're ready, Kurt, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
All right. So I'm going to start. I want to start by sharing a few stats, data points that I've seen recently, followed by a question. So the first stat or data point I want to share, it's from Gallup. Gallup has a report, the recent one. It's the 2023 State of the Global Workplace Report, where they conclude that around 20% of employees, only 20% of employees are engaged at work. And when I looked at what's their definition of engaged, they referred to the level of emotional and psychological commitment that an employee has working for a company. So it only 20% of people are engaged working for companies nowadays. So my question to you, Kurt, my first question is, in your experience as a chief people officer, what are the key elements that distinguish a thriving company culture from one that struggles to retain talent?
Thanks, Rodrigo. I think there are three things that I'll touch on and share, each of which have some components and complexity to them. The first is, I think, a really key part of having a thriving culture that's differentiated is how teams work within organizations. And so a little bit of the whole is some of the parts plus plus plus. And so really looking at culture on a team by team basis, and really understanding what's going on in teams in the organization. Teams are the unit of measurement in the larger team, which forms the whole company. And so what I found is that a lot of times when leaders and organizations are working on culture, thinking about culture, they're thinking about it at a macro level across the entire company. And I understand that, and my other 2 points on this question kind of speak to things at a more macro level. But I also think thinking about it at that unit of measurement, team by team, is really important. And some of the things that we in my firm at Leader really look at when we're trying to gauge the level of team effectiveness or healthy teams are things like performance. So what is the output that teams are actually yielding? So are the teams doing what they're there to do, not just how they work? There's also the composition of teams, and now is a really interesting time on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, with organizations like SHRM removing the E for equity from DEI. I would say we are still very much believers in the fact that you need to have representation and teams that are diverse, that are led inclusively. So I think that is really important in terms of inclusion. Alignment, you mentioned alignment in some of your opening comments, and I think making sure that people are all marching in the aligned same direction towards a common goal or goals in line with the strategy of the organization is important, and that's certainly something that can be measured. Um, Also linking that back to your stat from Gallup, we know that the extent to which the team is aligned around a common goal and in the same direction is one of the major informants to employee engagement. How teams work through conflict. I was recently on another podcast where the speaker talked about conflict is a competency. How you lean into it, how you navigate it, is you can have different levels of proficiency with that. And then I really liked what you talked about a moment ago around psychological safety. That's something that we always look at when we look at organizations overall, but also at the team level. So I think everything related to healthy teams is one of the three things. I think the second is that your culture is intentional, whatever that looks like for your organization. And people are quite judgmental about cultures of organizations. The biggest thing to me is that whatever the culture is, it's something that is intentional, not unintentional or being crafted or perpetuated on autopilot. And you'd be amazed, or maybe not, at how many leaders and organizations have a culture they're not even aware of what the culture is, or they have dissonance between what they in senior executive management or at the board level perceive the culture to be with how it actually is reported out as being by the people who work within the organization. Um, and so that intentionality, I think, is really key. And part of that means that it has the signature and the fingerprints on it of not only the workforce, but also the senior most leader, the leadership team, et cetera. And then the last category I would say is that the culture is modern, that it's sort of fit for purpose and appropriate for the time. So a lot of what we talk about in our firm at Leader is around modern culture and making sure that your culture isn't kind of trapped in the past and that it's not really serving or setting the table for the company to realize its strategic intention. And so elements of modernity in a culture, just to put some examples around it, include things like being more people first. So you hear a lot these days about a people first culture, which is a really authentic and demonstrated set of actions and practices in the culture that serve the people who comprise the organization. Professional intimacy is a really important concept of a modern culture. And so that includes things like psychological safety, but really something that I think started very much during the pandemic when we were, whether we wanted to or not, we were invited into people's homes. We saw their families, we saw their pets, we saw their homes, we saw things on their walls in their house that they didn't nor should have to take down because they're at work, because work came into their home. So we learned about people's viewpoints on controversial topics that in the past were taboo to discuss at work, like religion and politics and things like that. And so, really, truly enabling people to bring their full selves to work, and that managers and the company demonstrate an interest and curiosity and care for the whole person who's doing this work for them. And then also things like employees feeling that they have agency in their career. The meta level, macro level themes in the world around technology and consumer products, around customization and iPhone and I this and I that, that also applies to people's careers. So choosing your own adventure in your career, designing your own job, designing your own compensation package, having agency in who you work for and what you do and how you spend your day. Those are all just some of many examples of a culture that's very modern. So healthy teams, intentional culture, and modernity in the culture.
Yeah, great. No, that's those are three great points. And just to recap, I would start. I think that it makes sense to start by defining that. You mentioned the intentional definition of what kind of culture you want to have in your company, because
Hmm.
even if if you're not intentional, then you will get a culture anyways, whether you like it
Yes,
or
that's
not.
exactly right.
So being intentional and being able to define what's the DNA of your company and what are some of those characteristics and elements that you value as a company. And I've seen a few great examples where companies define what are their top three, four, five elements of company culture, and that works well to make sure that everybody really understands what those themes are.
Yes.
So I would start with that. I love the other thing that you mentioned around modern culture. That really means to me, at least my understanding, it's updating your company culture
Hmm.
and making sure that it's not that you also mentioned the fit for purpose, because
Hmm.
maybe the culture that you had when you were an early stage startup uh, does not really work, if you are a growth stage or you're reaching maturity or expansion.
Hmm.
Companies like Uber have gone through that transformation. Companies like Amazon have gone through that transformation. They had to update their cultures,
Yes.
uh, to make sure that they are taking into account where the company is and the people that they are attracting. And then finally, the third one that you mentioned, which I think is super important, it's healthy teams. And you
Hmm.
you broke it down, very nicely. Like, instead of thinking about company culture, you have to look at it at the lowest possible level, or the unit,
Yes.
and the unit is the team. And
Yes.
you know in my opinion, and please tell me what you think, but when I think about healthy teams, I think about four at least four things that are crucial, in my opinion. The first one is collaboration.
Hmm.
And when I talk about collaboration, I mean collaborating internally and
Hmm.
competing externally, not the other
Love
way
it.
around. I think that a lot
Hmm.
of people and a lot of teams, for many different reasons, they end up competing internally, creating a chaos inside, and
Right.
and not paying much attention to the customer. So I think collaboration is key, real collaboration. The other one is open communication, in my
Hmm.
opinion. Like, I think over communicating the good, the bad, and the ugly, not just the good. Then you mentioned this already, a safe place.
Yes.
Making sure that you have a safe place to be able to speak up and disagree with your
Hmm.
colleagues. And then the fourth one, it's a clear accountability. I think that
Hmm.
having clear roles and clear responsibilities, it's also crucial. So those are my four that I
I
would
agree.
look into healthy teams. But what do you think? Is there anything else that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I agree. There's none that you mentioned that I disagree with. I think, and I really love some of the things that you just highlighted about competing externally, collaborating internally. That really speaks to me. Uh, I agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things I would just say is that there is a science and an art to healthy teams. And one of the interesting things about my line of work, historically being an HR executive, now I'm an executive coach, among other things, is that everyone, because it's about people, everyone thinks that they're the expert on how things should work with people and culture and teams. But just in the same way that if you're a marketing professional or a finance professional, there's an art and a science to those domains. The same thing applies to team effectiveness, and there is a science to this, and people go to school for this, they get trained for this, and so we have really declared, I would say, expertise and a specialization around really understanding what has been proven to make teams healthy, and then the pull through from that really translating into solid business results and realization of the overall business strategy. And lots of opinions on that, but there is to a certain extent, a right and wrong way of doing that. And for us, part of that is really doing the diagnosis and the analysis of teams against the right dimensions. So I'm glad that you're pushing on this point about what are those factors. So we have a set of factors that have been proven to result in team effectiveness, healthy teams, and strong results. Now, then it's up to the organization to decide to modify that to suit their own preferences and their own organization. But again, said another way, there is a bit of right and wrong to that. That's a somewhat indisputable based on research and data. And you can use technology to help that. We use a technology partnership that we have to really use technology to get in there and assess how teams are working, how effective and healthy they are, and then really to put very cogent but practical action plans in place to optimize the level of team effectiveness. I think in terms of the things that you mentioned, there's nothing that you mentioned that I disagree with. I do think that, just again, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but drawing attention back to diversity of teams and creating inclusion is really key. Again, regardless of what people think on this topic, the research speaks for itself that teams that are diverse, that are led inclusively, yield superior outcomes, both in business and in science and in other domains. And the data is really compelling. So I think that's a really important one. And then I think one of the things that we didn't necessarily talk about is ways of working. So, historically, there's a lot of work that a lot of different organizations put into around what they would call governance, right? In terms of things like role clarity and decision rights and things like that. You mentioned accountability. I think those things are really important. In addition to that, though, I think the way work gets done in the organization, and that includes things like how you navigate conflict. That includes things like, you know, how are people going to actually execute the work and how much time is going to be spent on execution versus strategizing versus planning? Where is the work going to get done? What are you insourcing? What are you outsourcing? Which sites or other entities are going to do that? Some of that plumbing and wiring of the house is stuff that a lot of organizations really don't spend the right amount of time focused on. They spend a lot of time on the blueprint and the architecture of the house. They spend a lot of time on constructing the house, but really thinking about the less sexy parts of the architecture and construction around plumbing, wiring systems is something that's really, really important. One of my colleagues at Leader, Jenna Cohen, is an expert in ways of working, and she really pushes on this point because without that, the house can't function. And so I would just maybe add that into the mix here.
Yeah, very good points. I wanna follow up on something that you talked about just now, which is managing conflict. Um, if you are a CEO or a team leader, like knowing what you know, how would you approach managing conflict, and how would you train your people to manage conflict, you know,
Yes.
efficiently?
I'm actually really kind of geeking out these days on the topic of conflict. Again, I was recently on another podcast. There's an incredible leader based in San Diego named Rachel Yanes, and she is an expert in terms of conflict and this idea that conflict is a competency, and you can have varying levels of proficiency individually and collectively around conflict, and that conflict is needed and healthy in life, not just in teams, not just in culture and organizations, but in interpersonal relationships, marriages, etc. People are alarmingly ill prepared in the world to deal with conflict. There's not a single class that for those of you who are parents listening, I guarantee none of your kids went to a class or even attended a conversation about how to navigate conflict. So we're entering all these people entering into the working world who can't navigate conflict in their personal lives, let alone in the complexity of organizations. And people have very personal feelings and relationships with the topic of conflict that are informed all the way back to our formative years, ages 0 to 7, and what's sort of implanted in our subconscious around conflict, what we saw at home and at school and religious organizations and sports teams and things like that. And it's very complicated. So, as a coach, part of my perspective is on an individual basis, people need to really understand what their philosophies, beliefs, and practices are around conflict and what informs that, where that came from. So there's some individual work to do there. And then there's some team effectiveness work to do around coming to some agreements about philosophically how are we going to deal with conflict? Are we going to celebrate it? Are we going to lean into it? Are we going to, what does navigating it appropriately or effectively look like on this team or in this culture, in this organization? And I've seen the full spectrum. I worked in Bay Area tech, I worked in Seattle based tech, I've worked in PE backed organizations, I've worked in organizations that like Johnson and Johnson that and others that navigate conflict in a very different way than some of those other domains that I mentioned. And I think it's very personal to the individual, and it's very specific to the company, but it needs to be discussed, and there are agreements that need to be made. Just like for those of you who have families, talking about how you're going to navigate conflict in your family unit is really important. But those conversations are largely left unsaid because it's awkward. And so that's why I use this term professional intimacy, because conflict is intimate, not romantically intimate, but it's interpersonally and emotionally intimate. And a lot of people bring so much psychology to the table for the reasons I mentioned on conflict. So what ends up happening is conflict becomes quite messy and ineffective. And if you don't really deal with conflict in an intentional way, then it's really hard to have a very high functioning culture and really have an effective organization if the way you deal with conflict is suboptimal. So I think it's actually one of the most important things. And I will admit, I've evolved my thinking a lot on this. I think in retrospect, if I'm really honest, Rodrigo, because of my own relationship with conflict and my own psychology, I probably didn't really focus on this as much throughout my career as I was advising teams and leaders and about culture. And now I think it's one of the really important conversations that needs to be proactively wrangled.
Excellent. I love it. I really like this topic a lot. And I loved what you said earlier. You said conflict is a competency.
Yeah.
Conflict, like managing conflict, should be a skill, and it's a skill that should be developed.
Yes.
And just like you shared about yourself, also I have grown in that sense, and I've changed my kind of evolved my mindset towards conflict. And to explain what I'm saying, it comes to mind a recent interview that I watched, an interview that someone did to Bill Clinton, the former president, and he when he was talking about managing conflict and criticism, he said this. He said, "Take criticism seriously, but not personally." And because you can grow and you can learn and you can understand somebody else's perspective, but don't take it personally. Because if you're working on a project, if you're working on a company or something, leave your ego or your personal self outside the door.
Yes.
I also think that on the topic of conflict and conflict management, I think that bringing balanced perspectives, it's also crucial, in the sense that it's everyone has a different opinion on things, and if you make those conversations more data driven, the better. But also, I would suggest, like, take the time to understand before being understood. So like going around and really trying to make an effort to understand the different perspectives, it's key. And then after that, I would say come to agreements. You have to try to reach an agreement, and sometimes you will agree and sometimes you will disagree. But then, sometimes at the end of the day, someone has to make a decision. Sometimes it will be you, sometimes it will be somebody else, but sometimes we have to learn how to agree to disagree. And then
I think Rodrigo, the thought that's coming into my mind right now, and it comes back to this idea of psychological safety, conflict, and professional intimacy. So as those thoughts we're sharing with your viewers and listeners, and as those are rolling around in my head, the following kind of comes into my mind, which I just wanted to share, which is part of why part of a modern culture is so much about the emotional component, the emotional frequency, is because people can talk about the fact, they can say that work is work and there's no place for emotion, but the reality is work is one of the arenas where there's the most emotional undercurrent. And if you think about really soft, vulnerable emotions that people experience around things like fear, anxiety, and vulnerability. Um, there's so much of that that informs how people show up at work, and then how they lead, how they show up on teams. If you use the example that you mentioned about people competing internally rather than collaborating internally and competing externally, what informs that? I could probably guess that a lot of times that's informed by fear of failure, or desire to excel and win, and fear of the opposite of that. And so there's a lot of manufactured unnatural behavior and things that people do because of that. But if people feel secure in their footing, if they know that with their manager and with their company that there's some kind of version of unconditional professional love, and that they deserve to be there, and that they are valued, and that they may not always do things perfectly, that they have many things that they always will need to do better and improve upon, but that they deserve to be there, that they are valued, that they are professionally loved and cared for, then some of that unnatural posturing and defensiveness and internal competition, I think, really goes away. So I think you have to get down to that almost emotional kind of foundation and frequency of the culture so that people feel that way. And then what ends up happening is you get rid of a lot of that distracting, toxic dynamics and behavior, so people can give each other feedback. They can have conversations about conflict. They can collaborate more effectively because you're stripping away some of those distracting dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Kurt. Uh, I want to switch gears. I want to talk a little bit about culture fit, and by culture fit, I mean company and employee fit, right? So there is a I Glassdoor. They published a report where they say that 77% of job seekers consider a company's culture before applying. So more and more people are interested in working for the right company for them. So the question for you is, hiring the right people is crucial. Everybody knows that. But what strategies have you found most effective in ensuring that new hires fit your company culture?
So I love this question so much, and out of all the things that we're going to discuss today, this is probably the one that I run the most risk of sharing too much about. So just yank me off the stage with the cane if I wax poetic
Go
here.
ahead.
But um, I think probably the point in my career where I really learned a lot about this and experimented in a really productive way was when I was at Pinterest. Because when I got to Pinterest, the reality of Bay Area tech is, I mean, Pinterest and other Bay Area tech companies were experiencing 30+% voluntary attrition. And I got there after coming from biotech and life sciences, despite my time at Expedia, and just thought, how can you have a bathtub where a third of the warm water is leaving the tub? You're never going to be able to get enough nice warm water back in the tub. And so I really spent a lot of time studying this topic of culture and culture fit. So there are probably about three things that I've learned both from that experience, but also a lot of the work that I've been doing in consulting here over the last 7 years and now coaching. So the one is just a terminology thing that I encourage your listeners and viewers to think about, which is culture fit versus fit with culture. And not to get too languagey, but one of the things is that, again, back to diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes culture fit has been, that terminology has been used intentionally and unintentionally as a screen for, really housing bias that people have in discriminatory hiring practices. And so someone who thinks differently, looks different, acts different, has a different background, they're not a fit with, they're not a culture fit, and they just kind of get written off in that category. So I think really checking for bias and being mindful of DEI is a very important thing when you're talking about culture fit. And so when I was at Pinterest, our head of DEI, she made a very big point about there's fit with Pinterest versus culture fit because that language can sometimes be challenging. Um, the second thing I would say is for organizations that care, and again, I use this metaphor of a bathtub, right? So you have this beautiful bathtub with rubber duckies and beautiful smelling bath salts and nice warm water in the head, rest, okay? Um, and you take all this time to create the beautiful bathtub, and then you've got essentially to be really concerned about what is the quality level of the water that's coming into the bathtub and is the drain secure. So you don't want to be losing your people, keep the drain secure. And then eventually, if you stay in the bathtub as long as I do, you need to add some more water and you want to make sure you're not out of hot water and be very vigilant about who you're letting into your organization and what that water quality level is coming into the bathtub. So not all organizations care about that, but for those that do some version of culture screen or assessment of culture, um, who does it, when it's done, and how it's done are really important. So I'll refer back again to my Pinterest days. So when I got there, this was really important to them because the reputation that Pinterest had on Glassdoor and in Bay Area Tech was they were the kinder, softer, more human, gentler Bay Area tech company. Because a lot of Bay Area tech companies are just brutal cultures where, the cultures are really not ones that most people would want to be a part of, but they're there for other reasons. So this was really important. So I remember it was on my first day when I got there, and people were really proud of the fact that they had a culture council. These were people who had gotten trained to assess fit with culture. And I like many aspects of that idea. And you can create a council of people who you're not supposed to use the term tribal council now because it's disrespectful to indigenous people, but whatever the more correct version of that concept is, comprised of some of the people with the longest tenure in the organization, the culture carriers of the company at all levels in the organization. I think that's a really good idea. And then train those people in selection practices and how to assess fit with culture. And I think that's really important, again, while guarding against bias. The curiosity that I had when I got there, though, was they placed the culture screen as the last step of the assessment process. And so after people had had their 14 interviews and other technical assessments and weeks had gone by, the last step of the process was the culture screen or assessment. And so I asked to see what were the screen results, and about only 20% of the candidates who were going through the whole process who made it to the culture screen were making it through because the culture council was doing such an excellent job screening for this. I loved the fact that they were so selective. And as a matter by design, I actually think you should screen more people out of the culture assessment than keep them in if you really have a very differentiated, intentional modern culture. The problem is that it was at the end. So all of that energy and effort is very expensive and time consuming. So what I recommend is if you're really serious about culture and preserving your culture, put that at the beginning. So that should be one of the very first things. Do your initial screen as soon as someone seems to have the meet the general position requirements. The very first thing I would do is do a culture screen. And then that way, assuming only 20% of the people make their way through, it accomplishes two things. One, you have the savings of all the inefficiencies that are avoided that I just mentioned. But two, you don't have a false sense of security about your candidate pipeline going through the process because only 20% are making their way through. So you need to have a much better top of funnel to your candidate flow if only 20% are making their way through the culture screen, right? And then the last piece I would say is how do you really do a better job of identifying who's in the top of your candidate funnel from a culture perspective? So are there ways before they even show up that you can start to assess the fit with culture? And I think there are many, many ways to do that. And so one of the examples of that, we can talk about this more if it makes sense or not, is values, right? So you have company values, but a lot of the work that I do in my coaching practice is around helping individuals understand what their core values are. And then how does that fit or not fit with the individual values of other team members, of the leader of the team, and the values of the company? Because values are, we didn't mention it earlier, but they're a really key component of the culture of a company. And so you can get a sense of what people's values are about and their values composition, even by looking at their resume, looking at their LinkedIn, looking at their social media content, and in your very first conversation with them. So I always recommend that the very first conversation you have with the candidate in the screening process, you ask them two key questions. One is, what if you could design the perfect culture where it brings out the very best in you and you feel like you would be optimally engaged? Describe that nirvana environment. Paint the picture for me. And I even do things where I'll say, I'm going to close my eyes and I just want you to, paint the picture for me, describe that culture. And then I ask them about values. What are your individual values that guide you? And what are the values of a team or an organization or a leader that brings out the best in you? And if there isn't alignment there, then it could be a problem. Again, what you've got to then check against is that difference or dissonance diversity, and they're bringing a healthy, fresh, alternate perspective, or is it going to create so much friction because a lack of values alignment makes it very hard to have a high functioning culture?
Absolutely, and I really like this, and it makes total sense. So I'm just gonna recap what I just learned. The first one is, don't wait until the end of the interview process. Try to do the culture screen up front, to make sure that you don't spend time and resources in the interview process. So that makes total sense. And then the other key takeaway that I'm learning today is to ask two key questions. One, it's around values. Ask the candidate, or anyone that you're interviewing at your company, to talk about their values, their personal values, and
Mhm.
that way you will see if there is alignment with yours and your company. And the second one, it's like the second question would be, how would you create the ideal culture? If you
Mhm.
if you had a blank canvas and you had the opportunity to design the company culture from the ground up, how would you do that?
That's right.
Is that right?
That's exactly right. Spot on.
Okay, I love it. I love it. This is very, very, very helpful and very, very practical. Something that
Thanks.
all of us can do, um, you know, starting now. All right, thank you for that, Kurt. Let me just switch gears a bit more, and I want to talk a little bit about the role of the manager, the leader, and there is another report from Gallup. This is from 2022, and Gallup said, they found that managers account for 70%, 70% of variance in team engagement, highlighting the profound impact of leadership behavior on workplace culture. So, the question for you, Kurt, is, when it comes to the manager's role in maintaining a healthy company culture, what specific actions or behaviors do you believe are non negotiable?
I mentioned in the last category that was my favorite topic, but I think this might be my favorite topic, because this is why when I founded and was the CEO of Inspira, before I joined Leader, that was why I started the company. Because after spending 25 years in corporate HR, part of what I became really concerned about and even grumpy about is the fact that, back to the Jack Welch GE era of leadership, a lot of which I still agree with, there was this, fundamental concept of, management and leadership all starts at the top. You start with the senior most leader and you work your way down. And that applies to leadership development and effectiveness and all of the above. And I see the validity in that. I don't totally disagree with that. But the unintentional byproduct of that, Rodrigo, is that your frontline managers end up with the scraps. They end up as an afterthought. And so most organizations invest a lot of time and money and resource in developing their senior executives, their senior leaders, and holding them accountable, hopefully, in many cases. But they're not really looking, again, I use the term unit of measurement, down at the frontline manager level of unit of measurement. And those are the people who are leading these teams, as we talked about, who are the unit of measurement for culture building. So I can't emphasize enough that from where I sit today, looking back, on what I've learned in my career, and people ask me all the time. I literally get asked at least 3 times a day, if you could only get one thing right in your company or your culture or your organization, what is it? And I've been consistent on this for at least the last 7 years, which is invest in making sure that you have the best frontline people managers anywhere, and that you understand your level of frontline manager capability and effectiveness. And if that is suboptimal, it's like flying a plane without any radar. It is a very risky proposition. And part of why I'm grumpy on this topic is because, when I had my business, and our business at Leader now, we work with hundreds, over 300 different companies, and every single one of them self-reports that they have a suboptimal level of people manager capability and effectiveness. And then obviously my follow-up question is, and what are you doing about it? The majority of them are not doing anything really about it. And the ones who are, I ask, and how's that working for you? Are you seeing any really material shift in the level of capability and effectiveness? And they say no. So that has to be addressed. Okay, so that's the first big headline, I think, is that it's really, really important. Okay. The
Let me
second,
just,
I'm sorry, please, yeah.
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So to clarify, are you referring to leadership skills, like making sure that you have the right managers in place, that you hire, that you hire the best people, put them in the right role, and making sure that they have leadership and management skills? Is that what you're referring?
Yeah, let me speak to that a little bit, and maybe even take a step back, because I like the prompt. I think it actually starts at a more basic level, which is, what is the company's philosophy about the role of the frontline manager in the organization? Do they think it's important? Do they agree with my point of view, or do they disagree? Do they think, no, I mean, I hear what Kurt's saying, but it's more about senior leaders. The role of the manager is fine, but it's not that important. I believe it's one of the most important roles that someone plays in the company. It's like giving, someone the keys to the car, to the most precious asset you have. Your people are your most precious asset. I really believe that. And you're giving these managers the keys to the car. And at least in 80% of the cases that I've observed, there is zero preparation, zero training before they get the keys to the car. Who would ever do that? It's reckless. It's reckless and it's negligent. So, but that all depends on the philosophy of the company. Some companies don't care about this. They don't agree with me. That's fine. But there's some discussion that needs to happen around, philosophically, what do we think about the role of the frontline manager? Philosophically, how many managers should we have? So what is the right span of control of a manager? And and then philosophically, what does good look like from a management profile perspective? Okay. So there's just some fundamental philosophical alignment questions that we usually work through with our customers. Assuming that the answers to those questions are, it's really important, and we should have X kind of span of control, and then here are some of the things that we expect of our managers. Then I think there's kind of a technical thing, which is, what does the organization design and the footprint look like in terms of how many managers you need in the organization? What I find is that there are way too many people who have the keys to the car, way too many people managers in organizations. I was just talking to one of our startup clients yesterday, and it's a 40-person organization, and they have almost 30 managers. So, you've got these I formations of, everyone's trophy for everyone. Everyone's got their direct report. And so that's really problematic, because one, it doesn't feel very special. It's really hard to train 90% of the company. You have way too many people who perceive that they have, leadership responsibility and need to be in the room and part of the decision making and the conversation. And then you have this other population, which is the minority of the organization, that feel very kind of left out of what's going on. And so I usually recommend that you really, I think you can have way too many direct reports, but ideal span of control, 7, 8 people, but not one or two or three. Even for a startup, especially for a startup. So what happens is, once you do that technical kind of blueprint of how many managers you need, and you compare that with what you actually have, what you usually realize is we have way too many people managers. So what we usually do with our customers is we then say, okay, so today we have 45 people managers in the future, starting in 2025, we're actually going to have 20 people managers. That doesn't mean you're out of a job, but we are going to really press the reset button on what it means to be a people manager here. It's going to be a highly respected, coveted, valued, important responsibility. And what we usually find is that a lot of people become people managers for the wrong reasons, not because they are passionate about developing people and selecting people and engaging them and retaining them, but because they see it as a pathway to advance in their career and make more money. It's more about them. And
Absolutely.
so, right, so then what you want to do is really say, okay, we're going to go through a process to right size the quantity of people managers, and we're going to be very selective about who really gets to play this very vital role in the organization. And it's only going to be for our very, very best people who want it for the right reasons. And then the last part is what is expected of being a good people manager in our culture. And a lot of it's the things that we've already talked about today, Rodrigo. I think it's a genuine interest in putting people first. It's about care and investment of the person before oneself, not ego, but more servant leadership. It's about really being able to connect with your people and understand what they bring to the table and help them create a compelling employment experience for them, and to really be willing to be held accountable for hiring the best people, getting them focused on the right things, getting the most out of them, but giving the most back to them, and keeping them in the organization for as long as makes sense. And that is not for everyone. And so accountability and measurement and things like that are really important. And that all, in order to do all that, and this isn't a plug for my business, but you need a good Sherpa. You need a good guide to navigate that, because there's an effective way to do that, and there's a very messy, ineffective way. And then you need to get really serious about putting your money where your mouths are and investing in developing those individuals who you are going to keep in management roles and put in management roles, and then put a lot of investment in that. It's actually more important than senior executive development. So we do coaching for frontline managers. I actually think in some cases is more important than executive coaching. And cohort based development and individual development of managers. And I can't think of a better thing to spend money on in a culture than investing in your frontline managers. But unfortunately, it's one of the things that's often really neglected.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I have another question which I think could be related to what you just shared, and in the context of high growth, if you think about situations where a company is scaling very rapidly, what are some of the challenges in preserving and evolving and maintaining a company's culture? And
Yeah.
would you say it's the same thing, like making sure you have the right people in place? Uh, but sometimes when a company is growing so rapidly, things break in the process.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
one of my areas of subspecialty or expertise is scaling, because I worked for startups. I ran a startup, and now I would say 2/3 of my customers when I had my business and now are startups. And so working with and understanding the DNA of scaling organizations is something I spend 23 and a half hours a day thinking about. Um, and again, it's a science and an art. It's really tricky. So when it comes to that, kind of the interplay between scaling and culture, a few things come to mind. So one is, as the organization scales, being very intentional about what aspects of the culture you want to leave behind and are no longer going to serve you, and what new elements you want to bring into the mix, and what do you intentionally want to keep and preserve and maintain, and really triaging it in that way. So what do we have that we're going to leave behind? What do we have that we're going to keep? And what's new that we're going to add in? And how you answer those questions, there's a science to that again. And so we do a lot of work with our customers around really starting with business strategy. How is the strategy going to evolve? What implications of that does that have on the people in the organization and teams? And then what are the cultural implications of that? So, for example, a lot of startups, when they are in their infancy, everyone's involved in every decision. That's actually part of the culture, but it's part of the value proposition. Come work for this 8-person startup, and you'll have access to senior executives. You will be involved in every conversation and every decision, and that could be really appealing compared to let's say what it's like if you go to work for a big blue chip company and there's layers and layers and layers, right? Another example of, infancy startup culture is we're going to be non-bureaucratic and process light and, very innovative and bring your ideas to the table and you don't have to fill out a form to have them considered. Okay, that's great. That works when you have 8 people in the company, but suddenly when you have 600 people, being intentional about declaring, aligning from a leadership perspective, and then saying to your organization, that isn't scalable, that doesn't work. And so we will continue to maintain having an inclusive culture, but inclusion at 600 doesn't mean that you're involved in every decision and that you're in every conversation. And so we're going to leave that behind. But instead, what we're going to add is these other mechanisms to ensure inclusion. So that's an example. And this is where a lot of the friction comes. So oftentimes when a startup scales, there's some inflections that we've seen. So when you hit 25 people, we call that the full moon comes out. And that's when you typically get a lot of the infighting. You get your first sort of employee relations complaints and cases. You get some drama and some toxic behavior. When you hit 50, is another inflection, 100 is another, and then 500 is another. And what I've seen, like clockwork precision, is that it really, for some reason, it works out that way. And so you have to be aware of what are those big, scary, hairy monsters around the corner at each of those inflections. So part of the value that we add with our customers is, okay, now we're at scale. Now we've seen this movie, 5, 6, 700 times. You don't have to follow our advice, but what I can tell you is 497 times out of 500, 3 weeks from now, you're going to encounter this. And when I've had people who say, yeah, I don't think that'll happen in my organization. Okay, I've given you my best counsel. And then I get the call 3 weeks later. Interesting. It played out exactly the way that you forecasted. And I said, yeah, because there's a bit of a science to this. So I think that, so that's one, Rodrigo. I think the other thing is there's this sort of really counterintuitive thing with startups. So, when you have a startup, the best way I can say this is there is not nearly enough time and deliberate intention at the beginning to design all aspects of how the company is going to work. And so if you think about it, even from a talent perspective, almost no startup creates an initial org design for the company and puts it on paper. Almost no startup thinks about what is their diversity blueprint for the organization. Almost no startup engages in conversation about culture, bringing it back to what we're talking about today around what is our inaugural culture for the first phase of the company's existence from inception to, let's say, 18 months down the road. And then what does the next iteration look like and the next iteration? So really thinking about it almost like a maturity model regarding the organization, around culture, around leadership, and how do all these different dimensions evolve over the course of time in almost like a maturity map kind of way is something that's usually missing, but that I highly recommend.
All right, all right. Super interesting, Kurt. We are almost approaching the end of the interview, but before we go, I wanted to ask you a question about how to measure success. So we've been talking about how to build a strong company culture. There's many things and a lot of work that goes into this. Uh, but another question that I get a lot is like, how do you know if I am moving in the right direction? So
Mhm.
the question is, how do you measure the strength of a company's culture, and what's your opinion on employee satisfaction surveys, employee NPS scores, and etc. So what are some of the pros and cons?
You
So
ask
yeah,
the best
what are your
questions.
thoughts on that?
These are the best questions and the best topics. I feel like we could talk for hours more. Again, this is another topic I'm really passionate about. So, the standard practice for measuring culture are surveys. A couple interesting things that I've learned over the years about this, and some of my own suggestions for your listeners. So, one of the things that's very perplexing to me is most startups measure culture through surveys, but surveys that typically are very traditional and that are more fit for purpose for a big, large, global, multinational corporation. It's very strange. Like when I got to Pinterest, there was a 97 question survey, and the typical survey circus, as I call it, that you see in big blue chip companies, where the whole company comes to a screeching halt, and everything is about taking the survey, and then the survey closes, and then there's a black box for like a month, and then there's the action planning circus and committees and teams and everything, and that completely detracts from business continuity. It's very toxic and problematic and unnecessary. So when I got to Pinterest, one of the things I'm most proud of that I did there was I stripped out all of that. And I said, we are no longer doing a 97 question survey. I don't think any company should do a 97 question survey. And no disrespect to the Culture Amps and other large survey platforms out there. I have a lot of respect for them. But I really believe that this whole part of the industry needs a reset, and simplicity is key. So what I believe in is the following. I believe that you should absolutely measure things like culture and employee engagement. I believe that it should be done, and again, there's a lot of detail behind this, but just the headlines for your listeners. I think it should be done on a quarterly basis. I think it should be a 10 question survey, and every question is precious real estate, and the questions are consistent quarter for quarter. And then you have two bonus questions, only two, maximum two, always two, never more than two. Okay. And depending on what's going on in the organization or the culture, you pick what those questions are intentionally, but the other 10 are fixed. Every word, every piece of terminology is very clear and very intentional. If you have to create a key or a legend to translate for people what terminology means in your survey, you know you're on the wrong track. And so, and then people take it. It's a very short window. They take that survey. They have 24 or 48 hours only, and it is a requirement of employment that everyone takes the survey, and it's anonymous. And then the results are turned around within 24 to 48 hours. And every people manager in the organization gets a one-page report with visualization that shows them exactly the state of affairs of their team, and then that's rolled up to divisions and things like that if it's a larger organization, and there's one overall, and everyone picks one action, only one, and they go and they do that as a quick sprint within a number of weeks. And once they declare victory, they can choose to bite something else off or not, but one thing at a time, so it's not an action planning circus. And they declare success and then they move on. And then the only other thing I recommend is this is a very professionally intimate topic for all the reasons we talked about. So doing it as a one-way measurement mechanism through a survey is unavoidable, but it can't be the only thing you do. So what I recommend is if you really care about this, you bring in a consulting partner like us. We come in and we do live discussions with the top talent in the organization, and we ask them questions and we listen for nuance and we look at what's not being said and body language and all of those things. It also allows you to go deeper on a particular topic. So I usually recommend doing this after the survey so you know with surgical precision where to go deeper. And you do that as part of your ongoing investment. So if you do the survey that way, and you can do it self-run, you don't need to bring in some other big technology platform. And then you put the money instead of into the survey platform into live, professionally intimate conversations with top talent. You'll actually still spend less money, more time, but less money, but you will get much more richness and surgical precision as to where you need to address certain symptoms that you see in your culture. And then the byproduct of it is people feel very special because you're creating a mechanism that's not as painful and more professionally connected. That's the quick summary of what I've learned about how to really crack the code on
Sounds
that.
good. Sounds good. Let me ask you now one more thing.
Yeah,
So,
please.
and we're not going to go through the 10 question survey, but what are two or three of your favorite questions?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things that I would touch on, because we talked about it earlier, is this is one of the assessment and accountability measures for frontline people managers. So there has to be at least one of the questions, if not two, have to be about assessing the person's direct manager. Okay, so I think that's one. I think I mean, a lot of the topics we talked about, right? So I think some of it is around psychological safety, which could include things like bringing different opinions, voicing contrary opinions, and feeling comfortable taking risks, feeling comfortable bringing up and leaning into conflict. Those are all components of psychological safety. So I think psychological safety, assessing the manager, and then I think the last one is I mean there's so many. When you only have 10 or 12 questions, every question counts. But I think another one is you want to get some kind of early signal about intent to stay. I think there's utility in that from an attrition risk mitigation perspective. So really understanding if someone envisions themselves staying there, and if so, for how long. And then you can always do a double click into that around, if you were to leave at some point, why might that be? What might be causing that? And then you really get something. Maybe I'll add one last one, which is kind of the equivalent of an NPS, because the nice thing about an NPS question, as we even know commercially, is that when you ask about NPS, it's an amalgamation of all those other factors. So what it causes the person to do is say, okay, I may have answered this question really intensely and this one, just kind of middle of the road, but what is the synthesis and net of all that? The net is, would I actually, come work here again, and would I recommend it to a friend? And if the answer is no, if your NPS from a culture perspective is low, then you know that there's kind of multi-organ failure within your culture, and you've got to dig deeper as to what's going on.
You talked about one of the questions being around assessing the manager, assessing your direct manager. Um, how would you go about doing that? Because it can also be very subjective. Like in my experience, unless you're super specific with one question, if you ask someone, "Hey, like, what do you think about your manager?" or "Is he a good leader?" or it could be very, very subjective based on maybe recently he gave you some feedback and you took it personally, or maybe
Right.
I don't know what there could be like many different reasons, and I don't know if that question could have a lot of biases. So,
Yes.
what are your thoughts on that?
I think it comes back to that question of philosophically in the organization, what is the profile of what success, what an effective manager looks like, or what does success look like for a manager? And so, I still believe in competencies for management positions. And so, what you can do without having the person assess on every individual competency of their manager is you can say, you have a question about assessing the manager, and you can list there, what are the competencies that you expect of frontline managers in the organization, and then ask the person to provide an overall score of the amalgamation of all of that essentially competency framework for the manager position. I also think you can do an NPS question for the manager. Is that, would you work for this manager again, and or would you recommend others who you care about to work for this manager? So I think one or both of those questions. I think if you ask many questions about the manager, to what extent does this manager create psychological safety? To what extent does this manager, give you valuable feedback? It just starts to get too much and too exhausting. So I think 1, 2 questions max, but there's a lot within those
There's a lot
questions
in
is
that.
the right way
Yeah,
to do it.
that's super useful and practical, and something that we should all be doing. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Kurt, we are at the end. We are on time, and I just want to thank you again. Thank you for your time today, for sharing your experience, and thanks. Also, thanks to everyone else who has been watching and listening to the interview. Kurt, I wish you all the best, and thank you so much again. Bye bye. Thanks.